Okay, welcome to The Mind of a Theist, episode 3. I'm joined here with Joel today. He's a non-denominational Christian, and we're going to just be answering 25 of those familiar questions that you're used to. So, Joel, just introduce yourself a little bit. When were you a Christian? When did you first become a Christian, rather? Were your parents Christian? How did you come to faith, essentially? As briefly as you can, because we know testimonies can go for far too long.
So, grew up in a Christian family. My parents are both Christians. Lived in a Christian environment all my life, but became a Christian about 7 or 8 years ago.
Okay. No, excellent. So just to sort of, I like to sort of set the stage, as I'm calling it now, as a way to sort of allow our listeners to understand what they're sort of in for. So I'm just going to have you sort of define 3 terms. Some of them are bigger than others. The first one is, can you define evolution for us?
Defining evolution.
Or rather, how do you understand the process of evolution?
So evolution is the idea of things happening through random chance,
Okay.
developing mutations to a point where things become stronger. Generally,
Okay.
Survival of the fittest would be part of that.
Okay.
I haven't really looked much into evolution myself, into what the process of it are.
Yeah, that's fine.
Just what I've heard from others, so that's...
Okay, as I said, it's not a debate, rather it's just getting honest answers. So the next one is define God. If somebody who had never come up to any understanding of religious background or anything like that, they come from a culture that's completely secularist, right? And we'll make them an adult, because whenever we use this question, most people go to a child and they'll say like, well, we'll just tell them it loves you and stuff. So how would you explain to an adult, an educated adult, what God is if they've never even heard of the concept?
So God is a living entity who lives outside the confines of our universe.
Okay.
Who is all-knowing and all-seeing, and all good.
Okay.
So whether you want to define what good is or not is another question, but that's probably, the basics of how I describe God.
Okay. No, excellent. And finally, I've just added this question in due to a suggestion, but how would you define a Christian and how would you define an atheist?
So the only real difference I could say between a Christian and an atheist is their views on God.
Okay. No,
A
that's
Christian,
good.
well, more importantly for a Christian, their views on God and Jesus.
Yes.
Because there are many religions who believe in God or a God. So for a Christian, it's based on their views of who Jesus is.
Yes.
And who God is.
Okay.
For an atheist, it's the view that there is no God.
That's good. Yeah.
Yeah. That's for an atheist specifically.
Yeah,
not agnostic.
Not agnostic, not humanist, not Luciferian.
I mean, there's on both sides. There's so many different groups. So, that's probably but to summarize, a Christian is their belief in Jesus and God, and an atheist is their belief that there is no God.
That's perfect. All right, well, let's actually get into this a little bit. So how do you view God? How do you experience God? Is it a tangible thing? Is it a feeling? Or is it something that you experience on an intellectual level? How would you say that you know God? Or rather, know God is there?
Honestly, it's more than just, it's more than those. I mean, it is those.
Of course, of course.
It's definitely an intellectual thing.
Okay.
To the point where, and this is going to sound strange, but to the point where I actually talk to God.
Okay, okay.
It's also and that's not that common for Christians to say, just as a point. It's also can be a feeling sometimes, but mostly it comes from a practical understanding of the Bible.
Okay, very interesting.
From my views,
yeah.
to see that there's need for this, and that there's need for the love of one another, and that we're not capable of that by ourselves as people. We're really not. We're not good enough.
Okay.
And to see that God is, and to see that there's someone who is actually out there who is capable of wanting that for the world.
Okay.
I mean, there's millions of other questions that come from that, but
of course, but it's a simplified one.
But that's sort of in the time that I've got, that's the simple way of saying how I believe in God. And then just, I guess, the practical things that I see personally of what Christians do.
Yep.
Or I should say try to do.
Yes.
In loving one another in their imperfection, just like everyone else.
Okay.
That's, yeah.
No, that's a good answer. So how does that, let's sort of just explore the idea of that. How would you feel about the humanist sort of movement, where it comes from a secular sort of point of view, but they're still trying to help people? There's quite a lot of charity donations and stuff like that. Would you feel that there's a presence of God within them and they're unaware, or is it rather that some humans are able to surpass their sort of animalistic instincts?
Well, as a Christian, I believe that God created humans.
Of course.
Firstly, and if God and all good being created humans, then there's some of that innate goodness in everyone.
Okay.
Now, the lack of that is a different question, but the lack of that and the evil isn't actually a natural thing to people.
Okay.
That comes from our own stubbornness and choices of choosing something other than God. Yeah. So it's it's totally possible for anyone to do good things.
Okay.
But it's just as likely for them to do bad things. And so the difference between a Christian and a humanist isn't what you do. It's where forgiveness comes into it, and where Jesus comes into that. It's not that it's not that there are good or bad people in the world.
Yep.
It's that there are people who are both at the same time, and because of that, God does not consider any of us good enough because we have even a little bit of bad in us.
Okay. No, that's a good answer. So I know you're a first year, but can you provide one person who met Jesus, wrote about it, and whose existence is confirmed outside of the Bible?
Sorry, the question again?
So from a historical context of the Bible, so around the same era, we have a lot of historical documents that don't actually confirm any of what the Bible has said. Same with archaeological evidence and whatnot. Can you provide a source that isn't in the Bible that Jesus did in fact exist?
From around the same time period?
From around the same time period, yes.
Gosh. Not that I can think of off the top of my head.
No, that's perfectly viable answer. I'm glad.
I mean, there's people I could think of that are like 200 years later, but I can't remember their names right now.
Yeah, no, understandable. So with the Genesis count, why? Well, let's just begin with this. How do you interpret Genesis?
Oh boy. Up until like about a month ago, I probably would have said I interpret it as completely true isn't the right word. I believe it's true, but that it's completely factual.
Okay, so literal
guess.
Sort of.
Yeah, literal.
Yeah. Okay.
At the moment, I really couldn't tell you.
Okay.
I would probably still say it's literal. Regardless of whether it's literal or not, I would still say it's truth.
Okay.
So whether the exact way things happened that same way, whether it was a snake or whether it was eating of a tree, I would still agree that man was created.
Okay.
Did something against God's will.
Yep.
And then put us in the situation we're in now.
Okay. So would the overwhelming amount of evidence for things like, well, evolution is one, but not to just primarily go on that. Let's go with things like geology, history, basic things like this. How would you sort of is that a stumbling block for interpreting it as truth, or is that just not even in the question? Is that not? So yeah.
As I said, it's I'm not God, so I don't know the answer.
Okay.
I don't think anyone can truly know the answer to that question. For all I know, God created the world using evolution, using this process of having things form into what they are. I don't know if it happened in a day or if it happened in a billion years.
Sure.
I don't have those answers.
Okay.
I can't say one way or the other if evolution is true or not.
Okay. No, that's
because there really is there is a lot of proof for it.
Yes.
But there's also a lot of, within the church, a lot of contradictory proof that says evolution isn't real.
Yes, within the church.
But it's not necessarily, well, I shouldn't say proof.
Yes.
But there's a lot contradicting that within the church. So I can't really say if one or the other is true. But regardless, if God created the world, then he could do it any way that he wanted.
Okay.
He could use thousands, millions, billions of years, or he could do the exact same thing that looks like it takes billions of years in a moment.
Okay. No, excellent. Yeah, no, that's perfectly good. So have you come across the problem with evil yet? Okay, so the problem of evil is that if evil exists in the world, why doesn't God prevent that? So it seems like a very simple thing, but this is a huge stumbling block for quite a lot of people. So if evil does exist in the world, and God is omnimax, so God is omniscient and able to stop that, and able to do anything, why doesn't he intervene? So for instance, why do children get sick? The
question, why is there suffering in the world, in part?
It would be suffering. Yeah, suffering is...
that is part of it.
Yeah, suffering is part of it, but it's also in the nature of God. So for instance, if God creates everything, and he knows everything that's going to happen, and he's able to do anything, why doesn't he do everything and make the world perfect?
I don't want to just give the answer that I was spurted in Sunday school or whatever.
That's good. I'm glad. Yeah.
Like, because I could just very easily say, well, God is just and he's good, and he does what he wants, or God works in mysterious ways.
Yes. Favorite of that, yeah.
And I don't want to say that because because that isn't fair on whoever's listening.
Okay. Well, this is sort of a, it's almost a mental exercise in a way, but Epicurus, who is a great sort of philosopher, came up with this, it's a sort of way to describe the problem of evil. So it says, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? So would you have an answer to that specific quote, or would it sort of be the same where it's like, you know...
There's a part of this that hasn't even been talked about, which is God's justice.
Okay.
And his willingness to give free will to people.
Okay, yes.
To go, you have your own ability to choose.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, yet again, this sounds like a lot of what you'll probably hear Christians saying. This is the background I'm coming from, so
yeah, free will's usually used as a an answer to this question quite a lot.
Yeah, but apart from the free will answer, and the I guess the justice answer of saying that we've made our choice, and we have to deal with that. I mean, I guess the same ideal comes from a legal system.
Yep.
If someone were to do something against the law, then you would send them to, I mean, then they'd have to pay for whatever they do. Now, I can't tell you where evil comes from.
Yes, yes.
But I know that it's real.
Okay.
I can tell you, the only thing I could say is that I don't believe it comes from God.
Okay.
Because of what I
Okay, no, that's
what I hear about God and know about his character.
No, that's perfectly viable. So the next one is why, this kind of fills into that answer you've just given, but why did God create Satan? And by extension, why did God create atheists? If he can create anything and he doesn't want to send us to hell, if he doesn't want to hurt people and harm people, why create those things in the first place? Why give that option? Why make people just to suffer, essentially? I know, right?
I just feel like I'm spurting the same thing that you've probably heard a million times.
That's fine, trust me. They're quite used to that, I've found.
And like, I really wish that I could just sit down with someone and have them ask me this question themselves. To have them have a response.
Yep.
Because I do want to know what the other side is.
Yes.
But it's basically going to be the same answer as before.
Okay.
Which is that God is just and that he has to choose, that it's not based on his choices but on ours. That if we're choosing to do what's wrong in his eyes, not in our own,
yep,
then we have to live with that.
Okay. No, that's I'll tell you what, we'll skip the rest of the problem with evil, because I think that's sufficient of an answer to kind of encompass the whole thing. It is a fun one. So this other one is kind of from a little one. Is God active on other planets? If not, what is the reason for the rest of the universe? So basically, the universe is so vast and so big, and yet God created one planet with a single race that can worship him. Now, some argue, obviously, Francis of Assisi, for instance, that all things worship God in their own way. But why a singular planet? Why make a whole universe with just one?
I actually like this question. I think about it a lot.
Excellent.
Well, okay, so the first part of the question, do I believe that there could be life on other planets that worships God?
Okay.
Yes.
Excellent.
I believe there could be. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I think it'd be pretty cool to meet another race of people who live out there.
Excellent.
The second part of the question is that if that's not true, then why would he create the whole universe? I think part of it is just to show how big he is. I mean, you look at mathematical infinities.
Yes.
And you go, why do they exist? And part of the reason they exist is so that we can try and comprehend infinity.
Okay.
I think that's part of the reason the universe exists, is to try and comprehend an infinite God who is really hard to comprehend.
Yeah. That's terrific, actually. Yeah.
And I think that it also means that it allows... The other thing it does is it gives us clues on how the universe works. In looking at those things, we can go, oh, maybe we can try... finding of dark matter.
Yes.
And things like that. The Large Hadron Collider, that wouldn't have even been thought of if not for looking out into the stars.
Well, speaking of the LHC, let's go to CHZ. Actually, I don't really need to answer this. If you're comfortable with other lives in other worlds, that's fine. I can bypass this. I'm sure you've heard of Goldilocks planets and CHCs. Essentially, they're Earth-like worlds, and there's plenty of them. There's so many. Mostly named Kepler, which I found is really hard to distinguish when you're trying to explain them to people. So check them out. They're really interesting to have a look at. But we'll move into the third part of that question. So why isn't the universe, and by extension, we'll just say the Earth, the rest of the Earth, like things like even Australia and things like that. Why aren't they mentioned in the Bible? Why is it just one sort of single area, essentially? They don't talk about a planet. They don't talk about other planets. They don't talk about formation of like water coming from comets that pass through the atmosphere, etc. So why is this, essentially? All right, so how would you answer that?
Well, in part, I'm not necessarily looking at one of the books that was written, that's currently in the canon Bible. But if you look at the book of Enoch and you read through that, it talks about someone talking about stars and black holes from a perspective of not knowing what those things are, which is mind-blowing.
Okay.
To think of someone who didn't have access to a telescope, didn't have access to that technology, and still talking about those things.
Yeah.
The other part of it is just that the people writing it were still people who didn't have the knowledge and didn't know that there were other parts of the world. You look at most of the people in the early church, and they thought that Jesus was coming back in the next couple of years. Yeah. Because they thought the whole world was saved.
Yes.
They didn't know how big the world was. They thought that what they could see was everything.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a good answer. So I encourage any of the listeners to go have a look at the Book of Enoch. We've actually We're going to go through that and some of the Gnostic Gospels a little bit later. Anyway, why did God wait 4,000 years to provide a path to salvation so human souls can go to heaven? So, for instance, we have the common way to put it is that you know, the Earth is so old, and humans kind of showed up in the last 30 seconds of a 20-minute episode of something and declared themselves the primary protagonist of this. Because of that, and because of our sort of youth of our race, why did God wait that long if he was trying to if humans were created to form a relationship with God? Why wait that long just to start that relationship? And by extension of that, we have a look at things like Abraham, and civilizations have definitely existed before his lifetime. Now we could trace that to Adam, but there's people like the Mesopotamians, Hammurabi, Ashurbanipal, Gilgamesh, Enkidu, etc., etc. So why, in a sense, why not them? But another way is why focus on humanity, and why wait that long to actually appear and to sort of show himself?
Are you talking from a perspective of the Earth being much older than the people on it?
Well, yes. I mean, yes.
Okay. I personally, this is going to probably push some buttons, but I don't believe that the Earth is necessarily older than the people on it.
Okay.
I believe potentially, because it doesn't actually say that Adam could have lived for tens of thousands of years. Adam and Eve could have lived for that long without having children just as easily, because they didn't need to.
Yeah.
Or they did, and there's just no record of it.
Okay.
But as far as the rest of the question, why did he wait 4,000 years?
And that's 4,000 years as according to young Earth creationists as well. Why wait that long?
Right. Honestly, he didn't.
Okay.
In a way, I mean, you look at the book of Job and places like that, which is about someone who's not even related to that. And I'm sure, while there may not be any other written records of it, I'm sure that there are many other people who are aware of who God was in pockets. I think in part also it was, at least in the perspective of the Old Testament, in part that was there so that to prove that we can't get there by ourselves. And I think to give us opportunity as people, to say, look, here, you have a chance now. It was actually more of a grace thing to go, I want to give you a chance first to actually change.
Okay. So just to understand that, would you say that it was more of a free will thing? So humans had free will, and then God was like, I've had enough of this, you know, smack him behind the ears sort of thing. No, I missed it.
It's just a hard question.
Oh, okay.
I really don't know the answer to this question. I could give a really cliche cookie cutter answer, but I haven't looked into it. I haven't researched it. I couldn't do this question justice if I tried to answer it now.
Okay, no, that's a great answer. And again, perfectly viable. So given the thousands of other religions, why is Christianity correct? Oh, there we go. That was a word bubble. Out of all the thousands of religions, why is Christianity correct? There we go.
Well, yet again, it comes down to your view of God.
Yeah.
And who he is. And if you believe in God regardless of whether you agree with it.
Yes. Okay.
But if you believe God to be, even if you call him God, whatever you refer to him as.
Okay.
If you believe that entity to be omniscient, omnipotent, and good, then you have to come to some conclusion that we just aren't good enough for that.
Okay.
And if you come to that conclusion, then you need some way to be good.
Okay.
To be good enough. And if the only way to be good enough in this situation is through Jesus.
Okay.
Now, another part of this question would be to say the opposite. What if every religion
is wrong?
Well, no. What if every religion is right?
Oh, okay.
What if every religion was the right answer? Then would anything truly be the right answer? I mean, if anything could be the right answer, then wouldn't that make it okay for the militant Muslims in the world who are killing people? Wouldn't that make them justified? If you make everything okay, then there's really no boundaries.
Yeah, there's a popular sort of response to that, which is all religions obviously have not only divergence from one another, but they certainly have aspects in which they cannot reconcile. So for instance, in the Islamic faith, Jesus is a prophet because God cannot be flesh. If he exists outside of time, he cannot be flesh and not be contained into one sort of point. Even different Christian denominations have that. And then we look at things like Zoroastrianism, which has sort of the same aspect of this outside God, the pantheons. I could go on for a while, but the point is, the quote sort of goes, one of them could be right out of the thousands, or all of them could be wrong. So how would you sort of answer that? Because if all of them are right, that's almost impossible. They all contradict one another. But there is one option, which is that they're all wrong, and none of them are true. How would you answer that?
The way I would answer that would be that if all of them are wrong, then what is the purpose in anything? Not just in Christianity or in life, but in anything. Like, why do we get up in the morning?
Okay.
What's the point of even attempting to find out more about science?
Yeah. Okay.
What's the point in life?
Sure.
In life, not in just living, but in life as in, why should it exist?
Okay. Well, I actually can somewhat answer that. I'm not going to encompass everybody here, but Voltaire, for instance, who's a wonderful philosopher, one of my favorite. I would argue maybe one of my favorite. Anyway, he said that life is what you make it. So in other words, if there is no purpose to something, for instance, I'm doing these interviews almost as a hobby at this point, because I'm not going to get money or get famous from these, but it helps a small selection of people. So that's the purpose of those. The purpose I've made it is that I find it interesting. So in other words, same with life. By an extension, we could say my purpose is to collect every Muppets episode ever, which I've already done, and they're fantastic. Not the new Muppets though, it's terrible. It's an absolutely terrible show. But maybe that's my purpose in life. Or maybe my purpose is that I want to have a child, or I want to secure my DNA. If we're looking at a purely evolutionary standpoint, we want to preserve the species. I mean, when we actually look at a humanist, some of their beliefs, I'm not saying all, but it's the preservation of human life. And so scientific expansion and scientific research is done to make humans live longer, make humans expand outward. In a couple million, 100,000,000, years, I'm not very good with the exacts, but the sun will expand and Earth will be completely obliterated. Now, if we live that long, if we live to survive that, Carl Sagan famously said, if we do not destroy ourselves, we will someday venture to the stars. And we'll continue the human race, perhaps on different planets, perhaps being able to even see different forms of evolutionary expansion of the humans. Let's say if we had one with a high dense gravity, we might see short, stocky humans like dwarves. If we had one with a low gravity, probably elongated, Zoras from Zelda. So Voltaire would argue it's whatever you make it. It's whatever you decide is the point. And a lot of humanists argue that there's a lot of freedom in that, and there's a lot of sort of compassion in that as well, because it means that everything you do in life, if it's for another person, if it's a good thing, you're not doing it to get a reward at the end of your life. You're doing it because you genuinely want to, and you're not doing it out of compulsion, essentially. So that's sort of the answer to that. But again, that's not speaking to everybody. But what this would actually be a good lead into is, I have a question here that says, if you were to become an atheist right now, or rather if you did not believe, what would your select purpose be? How would you live your life, essentially? So if we take Voltaire's sort of understanding of the purpose of life, how would you sort of answer that?
Well, back to the other question. I think the other question is, you've explained all of that.
Yes.
But then what is the purpose in that? Like, what is the purpose in even having humanity continue?
There is none, and that's fine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that's where the perspective of God comes from, in that the purpose of life, not for an individual, but as life for the human race as a whole, is to be in relationship with God. That's where my perspective comes from. That's why I'm saying there is no purpose. I'm not talking about an individual's life here. I'm talking about us as a collective. As a whole, we have no purpose. We are aimlessly drifting in space. That is it.
Yep.
If we manage to get off this planet and go and colonize other planets, then we'll be still aimlessly drifting in space.
Yep.
On multiple planets.
Yes.
With no real direction.
Yep.
Except for, I'm going to have a baby.
Yeah.
And that sounds really dull.
Yeah. Well, see, Nietzsche and a couple of others would actually agree with you, that there is no purpose, and we're essentially assigned to our animalistic traits. But again, when examining that from a humanistic sort of point of view, it does come down to personal preference. Objectivity obviously comes into it, and subjectivity. Objectivity obviously goes out the window, and subjectivity is so introduced. But moralistically speaking, it means that people can define their own moral values. So if they find something that they struggle with in the Bible, they can bypass that. If they need to understand something like the problem of evil, they can then go, well, it's because we're drifting aimlessly in space, and there's no longer any struggle with that. So I think, not rather how you would answer that, but would you feel that's sufficient in a way?
The question isn't hard to answer.
Okay.
It's just hard to answer in a way that's satisfying to the listener.
Of course, of course.
Because the way I would answer that is the same answer I just gave, in that no, it wouldn't be sufficient.
Okay.
That's in part the purpose of of living. Now, you mentioned moralistically.
Yes.
Having the whole idea of our justice system and morals is a great premise.
Of course.
But if you throw that out the window by saying, whatever my morals are, that's okay, that's fine for someone who's fundamentally good or,
Yes.
or comes from an environment that is a really good home or doesn't have anger issues.
Yes, yes.
That's fine. But if you throw that out the window for someone who, I know, decides that serial murder is kind of fun and that's going to be their purpose, then where do you go from there?
You put them in prison.
Why?
Because if we're looking from a humanistic experience, we want the betterment of all humans. So what that means is that you have to define archetypes and normality within a society to ensure that the human race will thrive in its best sort of case. So for instance, again, somebody may decide that their cause is to do all the drugs in the world, which I would totally love to do. But let's say that that's their cause. What that means is that they are then a drain on that society and a detriment to that society because they are then harming others. So having something, even as a slither of empathy, of course humans are usually empathic. What that means is that we have this tendency to sort of avoid harming one another for the betterment of society. And if we look at that from an evolutionary standpoint, what we're examining here is that it's almost a pack mentality. Now you'll see something with water buffalo, for instance. If a bunch of water buffalo come up to a lake and there's a bunch of crocodiles in there, you'll actually see that an elder one walks into the lake and sacrifices itself. That's actually not what's happening. It's actually the younger ones push an elder one into the lake and the crocodiles eat the elder one while the rest of the herd moves on. So in the same way, somebody who wasn't obeying the morals of that society would be put in prison. I mean, we don't have euthanasia, but it's an option if somebody's really seeking that. If somebody is harming other people in society, they're obviously a drain in that society, and thus they're not protecting the herd or the pack. And so it kind of goes against us at not only an evolutionary standpoint, but it also means that morals are defined by the society that you live in. So let's say you did want to just kill everybody. If everybody in that society is perfectly fine living in fear, which I highly doubt they will be, then that's okay because it functions as a society as a whole.
Yeah, I haven't really thought about that question too much. As I said, I grew up in a Christian environment.
Sure.
Haven't spent much time around other environments, although I'd love to. Yeah. Okay. So I don't really have an answer to that. I'd have to get back to you and try and figure it out for myself to grapple with the question.
No, that's perfectly understandable. All right, well, let's grab a lighter one. Can God... Okay, you've probably heard the stone one. I like this version better. Can God make a burrito so hot that even he himself cannot eat it?
I can't answer this question.
That's actually a good point. Yeah.
No, I can't answer this question because I now have other people's views on it.
Oh, really?
No,
okay.
Remember we had this discussion in the hallway?
We did indeed. That's true.
So I've discussed this with other people who are probably going to answer this question. I could answer it, but I wouldn't be giving my own opinion. So it's not fair for anyone who's listening for me to answer this question.
Yeah, thanks. That's actually really, really good. I'm glad you said that. So let's move on to if you were born in another country, let's say Mesopotamia, under the rule of Sargon, where primarily everybody worshipped Ishtar and El and things like that, and Ea. Would you still be a Christian? What do you think?
Well, firstly, I'm not.
That's true. That's true. Okay.
It's a very different question. Like, if I was in that situation being asked this question, it would be a very different answer to what I would give.
Of course.
So yeah, it's not a question that I can really answer without being in that situation. The only thing I can say is that I am thankful for the situation I've been put in.
Okay.
For growing up in a country that has a Christian population.
Sure.
For having that opportunity. I mean, the other question I guess you could ask from here is it fair that people grow up in places that aren't Christian or environments that aren't like that? I mean, this is a question for a Christian from a Christian. This isn't a question an atheist would necessarily ask or anyone who's not from that environment.
Yeah.
I would also say, is it fair that I live with sickness every day of my life? Like, it's a different question than just simply saying, if you grew up in this environment, would you be this?
Yes.
Probably not, but I also wouldn't be me.
That's true.
I'd be someone else.
Yeah.
And that someone else lives in our world today and is probably one of the people listening to this who didn't grow up in that environment.
Yes.
And therefore, they are not a Christian.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not really a fair question.
No, okay, that's fine. So do you think, actually by extension of that, to those people who don't grow up in those environments, this kind of goes into almost Calvinism versus Arminianism, yeah?
The inverse could be asked as well. Let me...
Oh yeah, go. No.
The inverse question could also be asked. If you, as an atheist or someone who's not in that situation, had grown up in a much more Christian environment, I mean, some of you probably have, but for anyone who hasn't, if you grew up in a Christian environment, would you be a Christian? It's the same question. If you grew up as a Christian in a Christian environment, would you be a Christian? But then, would you also be you? Like,
yeah.
It's the same question from the other perspective.
Okay. Well, a lot of atheists in Christian environments would argue yes, because they've grown up in a Christian environment and then become an atheist later in life. The question more pertains to the fact of whether God elects a set few, or whether God... So, for instance, if you were born in an area that wasn't Christian in the slightest, is that because God loves those people less? Or not even use the term love, but is it because they're unworthy of salvation or something like that?
See, I sit more on the perspective of people having free will to choose.
Okay.
But
if they're not offered the choice.
But if you're not offered the choice, if you're not offered the choice of following God, then how do you make that choice? I mean, it does make it unfair to say God didn't choose those people or chose these people.
Yeah.
But to say, and honestly, life isn't fair.
Yep.
I mean, everyone knows that. Regardless of which side you're on, whether you believe that, I don't know, maybe you believe that it's unfair that people are Christians and that they shouldn't have to live with the hypocrisy of that. Sure. And live with being deluded all the time.
Okay.
But a Christian would also say the opposite and say it's unfair that there are people in the world who don't even have an opportunity to know God. I mean, I'm going back to the fairness question rather than the other question, but that's really where I feel it comes from. It comes from being given that choice, and most people aren't. is the honest truth.
All right, well, let's go into a little bit of hypotheticals. So if your child was of another faith, how would you deal with this?
Definitely hypothetical because I don't have children.
Not yet.
But they'd still be my child. I mean, I'm not going to love them any less just because they're of a different faith, because they've made a different choice.
Yeah.
I would prefer if they chose to follow the same faith as me, but
Of course.
I'm not going to force that down their throats. That's yet again not fair.
Yeah.
And that would make me a bad parent to say, if you don't choose what I choose, and it would also not be what God would do.
Yeah.
From the perspective I'm coming from. I mean,
Yes,
you may believe that or you may have grown up with parents who tried to force God down your throat. And so that's how you view God.
Yeah.
I don't view God that way. I view him as someone who gives free will and choice. And yet again, and most of these questions come down to your view of God.
It's true. Yeah. I'll agree with
So it's anything I say you can probably rebuttal with something else because you view God differently, or you probably view that there is no God. But yeah, I wouldn't force someone to be a Christian just because they didn't want to be.
Okay.
I would give them reasons why they should be, but if they didn't choose that, then I mean that's their choice.
Well, this kind of goes into your view of God, I guess. I think in a way you've already answered it, but I'll ask it regardless, just in case you have something to add. So when we look at hell, for instance, in a way that is God looking at his child making another choice and then punishing them for it, does that mean that God is a worse father than most humans? Does it mean that God is still good? Or is that an evil aspect of God? How would you sort of rectify that as a Christian?
Can you repeat that?
Okay, so if you wouldn't, because they're still your child, as you said, and you wouldn't want to bring harm to them or force them into anything, the fact that God and hell is a aspect of Christianity, how would you sort of reconcile the fact that God punishes those who do make another choice? For instance, worshipping another god or not worshipping at all. Would you say that that makes God less of a father than most humans?
Well, firstly, hell actually isn't really mentioned in the Bible. I've heard that come up twice now to say God is evil and sends people to hell. He doesn't. He separates them from himself, which in choosing not to follow him, you've already done yourself anyway.
Okay.
So really, the only difference is that instead of being with God, you're not with God. Okay. And whatever that means to you, we in the West, for whatever reason, have decided hell is what it is. But the only mention of hell in the Bible is, or the only equivalents are other religions' versions of hell.
Sheol, Hades. Yeah.
Sheol and Hades. Which aren't necessarily what hell is like. It's a depiction of what it could potentially be like, but we don't know, because in order to know, you'd have to die and come back. And there's only a few people who've ever done that. Okay.
So this is another, if commanded by Yahweh to do as Abraham would do, would you do so? Because, actually, I'll just ask that one to begin with.
What do you mean by that question? Because that could be taken a lot of different ways. If you mean do exactly what he did, do you mean sacrifice my own child? Or, like, where are you coming from with that question? Because Abraham was just a man.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So obviously Abraham was commanded by Yahweh to sacrifice his child. Abraham was going to follow that because of his faith, and that's usually seen as a grand gesture of faith. So would you do the same thing? Would you sacrifice your child if commanded to do so? Yeah.
No, I wouldn't.
Okay.
Honestly, because if you look at Abraham's faith, he didn't have access to those who come before him. He didn't know God's character.
Okay.
But from what we know now of God's character, he wouldn't do that. In fact, he hasn't asked anyone else since then to sacrifice a child. If you look through the entire Bible, there is only one account of that. And that was in part because because Abraham didn't know what God would answer.
Yep.
And so it was a sign of faith.
Yes.
Rather than a sign of malevolence.
Okay. No, that's perfectly fine. So another is if. Well, I think that answers it. Usually I go into a sort of like, if Yahweh commanded Christians to do a suicide bomber, would you do that? But if it's coming from God's character, I suppose that answers that too. All right, so finally, does God already have a plan? So does God have a set plan for everybody?
This goes into a different question, which
does.
is, are you talking about a specific plan or a general plan?
We'll say specific because omnipotence and obviously means that you understand every outcome, you understand everything that's going to happen. So if you were living in linear time, then you're confined to the aspect of time itself, much like humans are. If you exist outside of time, this wouldn't be a problem. So if you are Omnimax, surely you'd be able to see where every path leads. This is usually a Calvinistic sort of way of viewing things. A lot of people think that it means that you're sort of a robot. What it actually means is that he already knows what's going to happen, despite your choice in the matter. So and that's just an aspect of omnipotence. Kind of goes back to Epicurus a little bit as well. I mean, obviously, if he's omnipotent and knows all the outcome and yet still gives you free will, then does he really know the outcome, sort of thing? So how would you sort of answer that? Does he already know everything you're going to do, or is it up to you?
I think there's an area where people often get confused, which is knowing everything and affecting everything. You can know something is going to happen without choosing to change the outcome.
Yes. Okay.
And I think I'm trying to think of a hypothetical situation where that's true. It's hard because we live in linear time.
It's true.
To think of an example. But you could say, for example, you had a time machine. You could go back in time, and you know what's going to happen because you've read about it. You may have even seen it, may have even been in your own life. Now, whether you actually choose to affect that,
yes,
is a choice.
Okay.
You don't have to go, okay, now because I know something, I'm going to change it. Yeah,
the Marty McFly approach.
Exactly. You don't have to affect a situation. I mean, the only real way we can do that is playing a video game through twice. A video game through twice, or watching a movie twice. You know what's going to happen, but I mean, in those situations, you can't necessarily affect the outcome.
Yep.
But you can play through the same thing twice and not necessarily have to change what happens. But you could.
That's true.
You could make things happen. And going back to God, he could do that.
Okay.
It's not to say he can't, but if you come from the perspective of free will existing, which hopefully all humans do, because we all make our own choices, then, I mean, actually that's not true. We probably don't all believe that. But
yeah, there's a huge amount of section of Christianity, Calvinism, which is actually quite the opposite, in which it's they would believe the opposite, in which you're predestined to do everything. Destiny is actually a good aspect of that. You know, the Greeks were big into destiny, same with Zoroastrianism, Zoroastrians, sorry, in which they believed everything was sort of predetermined, but it's neither here or there.
Yeah, see, it's kind of a really strange thing. See, yeah, I could sit and argue with a Calvinist for a while, but that's not really the purpose in answering these questions. But to that, I'd probably say, does that mean that what time you're going to brush your teeth in the morning is decided by God?
Yeah.
Does that mean, like, so my point comes from, this isn't saying that God can have people make choices, but what's the point in doing that? If everyone's just, yeah, see, I always go back to the robot thing.
Yeah.
Because if everyone's not making their own choices, then, well, maybe here's a better question. If everyone isn't making their own choices, why are there atheists in the world?
Yeah, okay.
Even if it is, as it's written, a book that God has that has different names in, that doesn't seem like a just God. It doesn't seem like a very just thing to do, to choose one person over another, when what Christians believe is that no one person is any better than any other. So why would you pick one person over another?
Okay. No, that's a good response. So we'll wrap up there, but that was awesome. Thank you for letting me interview. So at the end of these things, I like to do a little sort of plug for something that's either interested you, a book that might have helped you come to faith, something that you see as almost like a evidence of God. If not that, feel free to plug a youth group or whatever you really want, and I'll plug something random that I can think of for my theistic friends to watch. So it's this sort of a give and take, if you will. So while you think of one, I'm just going to plug. Unfortunately, I can't find him, but I'll tell you what, I'm just going to plug talkorigins.org again. I'm also going to plug Richard Dawkins recently came out with a lovely little, I wouldn't call it a game, but it's pretty good. It's called Mount Improbable, Play with Evolution, and you can find that at mountimprobable.com. Basically, it explains the fundamentals of evolution through a little game. It's very fun, and yeah, maybe you can have a little try of it, and yeah, it's good. So anyway, Joel, anything you want to plug?
Not really.
That's fine. Okay.
Not that I can think of a spur of the moment.
That's all right.
More time.
I should have. All right. Anyway, that's the third episode of Mind of a Theist. Again, thank you, Joel, for being here. And we'll catch you next time on episode 4. I think we might have one with a plungy, which is a 0.5 year student here, or possibly a third year. We'll see who comes to me first. Anyway, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.